Today I want to speak to you about this thing called worship. What is this thing called worship? And why do we Unitarians, liberal religious rationalists that we are, need worship? Why do we choose to engage in worship? And as we do indeed seem to engage in worship, how do we do this worship? And how well do we do it? As you would imagine, I suppose, me being the minister and all, I like worship. I'm fascinated by worship, endlessly fascinated by it. And I suppose I'm even passionate about it. I love all aspects of the service. And as you would expect from a Unitarian minister, I like the sermon the best. But I also think that too many Unitarian ministers and lay leaders pay scant attention to the other elements of the service, believing that only the sermon matters in a Unitarian church. This is to the great detriment of the service itself, to themselves as worship leaders, and to the congregation as a whole. For the other elements lead us from profane time into sacred time, and they then set the scene for us to lean into the sermon and really experience it to its fullest extent. Those other elements then catch us gently after the sermon has been experienced and lead us out of sacred time back into profane time. So what is this thing called worship? I am often asked. Worship literally means worthship, giving worth to something. That's all it is. And the great mystic and writer Evelyn Underhill defines worship in a delightful way. The language is quite old-fashioned and we would say sexist, but I still think it's a useful definition. Evelyn Underhill says, "Worship is the adoring acknowledgement of all that lies beyond us, the glory that fills heaven and earth. It is the response that conscious beings make to their Creator, to the eternal reality from which they come forth, to God, however they may think of him or recognise him, and whether he be realised through religion, through nature, through history, through science, art, or human life and character." Each and every time that I approach worship preparation, I say to myself, I want to explore something this week that really matters. And once I've decided which of those things I want to explore, I go away and explore it, or research it, or think about it. And once I've explored it, I then give worth to that thing and offer it to you in a service of worship, a service of worthship. Worship, especially when it's done well, is an ethereal and mysterious thing. Worship is much like the sound of one hand clapping. Perhaps the best way to approach the exploration of worship or worthship is to say what it is similar to, but not quite. Worship is a bit like theatre. It uses tools that could be described as theatrical, but it very definitely is not theatre. And the worship leader may use some tools of the actor, but he or she is definitely not an actor. Worship is a bit like the classroom or the university lecture hall, and it is, of course, a learning environment. But it very definitely is not a lecture theatre or a school. And while the worship leader may use the tools of a teacher or lecturer, he or she is definitely not either of those things. Worship may have aspects of the therapist's room within it, but it is definitely not a forum for psychiatrists, psychologists, or counsellors. And while the worship leader may draw heavily upon these tools in worship preparation, they are definitely not a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or a counsellor. And while a worship space can resemble a lively social club, it is not such. And while worship leaders allow for fun and spontaneity and unplanned contributions from the community, they are not an MC at a social function. And I might also add that worship does have elements of the courtroom and uses the rigour of a lawyer, It does resemble the Houses of Parliament, and we might not like to admit it or not, but we do use the powers of persuasion of a politician. And when I was at Military College, my lecturer asked us all to go away and watch videotapes of the then British Prime Minister Tony Blair. When we asked what use that was, he said, "He's a great orator, but I want you to look at the difference between sincerity and authenticity. There's a difference." When preparing worship, the ideas and the initial patterning are the art of the process, and the placing of those ideas into an easily recognisable ritual is the craft of the process. The ritual of a Unitarian service is the frame or the container of the service, the space and time marked by the sounding of the gong at the beginning and the last note of the postlude at the end. Our Unitarian ritual is the frame of our order of service, and the tools within that frame are our opening words, our music, our story for all ages, our candles of joy and concern, our readings and meditation, the sermon or address, our hymns, and our closing words. And it is within and through these tools that the dynamic process of worship takes place, the journey that ascribes worth to that which matters. The Unitarian Universalist ministers Wayne Arneson and Kathleen Rowlentz did a 2-year study of Unitarian worship in the United States and came up with findings that they felt made for good worship and that they felt made not for good worship. And while there are some local differences, I was amazed at how much of the findings of the research applied to this congregation and also to the two that I served in the United Kingdom. Arneson and Rowlentz didn't focus very much on the sermon, as they felt that extensive studies had already been done and many books written on sermon writing and delivery. So they focused on all the other aspects of a Unitarian service. And I'd like to share with you some of their findings. Of particular interest to them was the way the congregation entered into worship, the transition they made from their regular life of work and family and chores into the time of worship. They said a clearly defined ritual is necessary, a chalice lighting, a gong, a procession in of the choir, or a reciting together of a familiar church poem or prayer. All this marks the shift from the profane time to sacred time and readies us, as does some small space for silence. Our music is important, they said, and by this they meant the music of the prelude, interlude and postlude, and our hymns. And we are certainly very lucky here with our wonderful regular musicians, Brendan, Margaret, Tony and Daphne, and all our guest musicians and choirs. Music links us to our heritage. Our hymns often remind us of our liberal Christian heritage. And here in Adelaide, our organ is the one our ancestors played in the Wakefield Street Church. The authors also emphasised the importance of congregational symbols, physical things in our worship space that help us to remember our Unitarian story and values and help us to ascribe worth to these things each week.